Now, Elizabeth May has been at the Paris talks from the beginning. Earlier this morning, we spoke with the leader of the Green Party about her initial impressions of the draft agreement just after it was announced. And now that she's had a chance to read over the details, we've brought her back here live on CBC News Network from Paris. Thank you once again for joining us. You've had a chance to go over the draft text now. Does anything stand out to you?
It's a very well-constructed text. It is balanced. It is ambitious. It manages to, I think, accommodate the concerns of various blocs around the world and specific nations. Now, we shall see. I think it needs to be stressed that this text was only just read by me and the delegates. We reconvene in the Conference of the Parties in an hour and a half or so for a discussion, a debate, and then we will see if this agreement is accepted. It remains right now a draft proposed text from the president of the COP, the Foreign Affairs Minister Laurent Fabius, but it was very, the level at which it was presented, and you and I have talked about this before, Rashmi, but having it presented with Ban Ki-moon on one side of Laurent Fabius and the president of France, François Hollande, on the other side, very clearly they're saying this is the best we're going to get, not just now, but probably ever. Grab it with both hands, and then we start the work, which is substantial, to constantly push for greater levels of emission reductions than what we now have.
Well, and some of the contentious issues as we were following this over the last couple of weeks was developing countries versus developed countries, the richer and poorer countries, who's going to win, who's going to lose, and then the emissions cuts, right? So who would you say are the winners of this as you go through those details?
Let's hope it's our grandkids. We start with the fact that the 1.5 degrees as a target to strive for. The agreement has been bounded for some years around the idea, the negotiations around we must at least ensure we avoid 2 degrees global average temperature increase above what it was before the Industrial Revolution. The inclusion of and 1.5 degrees is better. It will create greater safety. It is going to reduce impacts. The inclusion of 1.5 degrees is huge, and that is a win, frankly, for civil society, for environmental groups, particularly for the group 350.org, 350 referring to 350 parts per million, which is the level at which we have to reduce our concentrations in the atmosphere in order to hold temperature increase to 1.5. This is a big win for a lot of people who've pushed for a more ambitious treaty. But it's also, you have to recognize that people, all of us would have wanted more. We would have wanted to say reduce X amount of emissions by X year. All of those targets are housed outside the treaty and are located in basically housed at the United Nations building as we go forward with this agreement. So there's winners and losers in a bit of compromises here and there. The U.S., for instance, took out its requirement on loss and damage that countries agree that there is no liability or compensation regime. But at the same time, the U.S. got something they needed, which was that the $100 billion pledge is no longer in the text of the binding agreement, but is rather in the decision document part of this text. I know that's awfully legalistic and hard for people to follow, but it's a well-crafted document. And Laurent Fabius, I think, fingers crossed that we've pulled this off. We don't know yet. China or India or Saudi Arabia might try to block this. We have to hope at this point that we can have a conclusion and support this. This has ambition in it that I didn't expect to see. This embraces the concept of climate justice, something else that people around the world in the people's movements should be pleased to see.
Okay, but the targets aren't legally binding, and then the $100 billion isn't legally binding either. What is legally binding then?
Well, the agreement is legally binding, and it says, the agreement says that we will all strive to avoid 1.5 global average temperature increase, and we must certainly avoid 2 degrees global average temperature increase. It binds countries to meet regularly, and in fact on a regular 5-year basis, have what's called a global stock taking, at which, informed by the science and informed by knowing how many gigatons of greenhouse gases we have reduced and how much more we have to do, every 5 years there's pressure on every country to do more. So this is not an agreement that solves the world's problems. This is an agreement to periodically hold everybody's feet to the fire and do better and do more and reduce emissions faster. Because we all acknowledge, everyone knows, that the current promises that have been tabled at the UN are far from adequate. They go roughly halfway to what needs needs to be done. And with every year that goes by with inaction, we make it that much harder to avoid the global disaster that awaits us if we allow global average temperature increase to go to 2 degrees or higher.
Yeah, and we see that on the streets of Paris right now. The activists that have gathered from around the world over the last couple of weeks are demonstrating right now in response to the details of this deal, assumedly saying that we could have done more, right? From your perspective, what more could have been done? What did we lose? What did we lose out on here?
Well, I have to say it's what. Well, you know, it's wonderful to hear Ban Ki-moon, Secretary General, and Francois Hollande, President of France, saying, you know, the pressure from civil society matters. They embrace the pressure. So we are all in a situation where we know we could do more. But when you get 195 nations in the same room, and they include nations with as diverse interests as China and Brazil and Saudi Arabia and the United States and the least developed countries, the poorest of the poor and the low-lying island states, to have anything that, and my standards are pretty high, Rashmi. I don't want to paper over a bad deal and say, hooray, we have something. I've been working at this too long. I've been working on trying to get a climate treaty since 1990. This is not the end of the road, but unlike Copenhagen, this actually puts us on a good path to continue to reduce emissions as rapidly as possible. It's got the right framework to keep pushing, and it's got what developing countries need to see. The $100 billion commitment is in the decision text, which means it has status. It's in the decision text of the Conference of the Parties. But by keeping $100 billion out of the agreement itself, I believe what will happen is that the U.S. will be able to legally agree to this treaty being legally binding, which is very important. It doesn't have enforcement mechanisms. That's a key problem. But we haven't had enforcement mechanisms in an environmental treaty since 1987. That is a political problem. That's because world leaders give more attention to trade than they do to climate. But given what we had in our hands as possible when this negotiation began November 30th, the climate and our grandkids have done very well.
Prime Minister Trudeau has pledged a climate deal or agreement or a strategy with premiers in the next 90 days. Can you anticipate any sort of conflict with the premiers and the municipalities as it trickles down in Canada?
I think that it was a very good decision of the Prime Minister to invite so many premiers here. It did make the delegation larger because they brought their ministers and so on, but it means that they're aware of what's going on here. So nobody at the provincial level of government in Canada, nor for that matter the municipal order of government, the Federation of Canadian Municipalities was very visible at COP21. A number of our major mayors were here. There's an understanding, I think, at all levels of government, and including within First Nations, who will play a very important role, that Canada is going to have to do far more than we have done ever, and certainly in the last 10 years of not just at the federal level, not just inaction, but sabotage against this kind of treaty. We have catch up to do. We're far behind. But let's take a spirit that comes from, okay, if you listen to the words of President Hollande and Ban Ki-moon, that we are here on December 12th, 2015, making history in Paris. And this is the turning point to a future that's fossil fuel free. This is a very large commitment. It immediately means that we have to think about how do we transform our economy. It's not a small end of the tailpipe solution. We have to be looking at, over the next couple of decades, an economic transformation to where our energy sources are all renewable. It's totally doable, and we have the tools. We know how to do this. We have the political will, I believe, now. And to take a line from Laurent Fabius here earlier today, the stars are aligned. When we get home to Canada, all of us who care about climate action and having a secure economic as well as climate future for Canada are going to have to really do a whole lot of work to meet that 90-day deadline. But it makes sense to work immediately because the world will be gathered at the United Nations on Earth Day 2016. That's part of this decision, is that Ban Ki-moon is being asked to put together a major signing ceremony on Earth Day 2016. Ideally, Canada shows up with the plan that we will have worked on. Not all the details, obviously, but a very good sense of what we can achieve as a country in new targets that we can table with the United Nations.
Well, we'll have to see if history is made today with the ratification of this draft text. Elizabeth May, we do appreciate your insight. Thank you once again for joining us again. That is Elizabeth May, the leader of the Green Party.
Great to be talking with Canada.
She spoke with us from the Climate
Thank
Change
you.
Talks live in Paris.